Hashtag they refused to serve me because I looked homeless. Then the mayor walked in and hugged me. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the streets into rivers of despair and my worn jacket into a soggy mess that clung to my shoulders like a second skin. I pushed through the glass doors of Henderson's Diner, the warmest-looking place on Main Street, shaking droplets from my matted hair as the little bell above announced my arrival with a cheerful chime that felt mocking given my circumstances. The waitress behind the counter looked up from polishing glasses, her smile fading the moment her eyes took in my appearance, the torn jeans held together with safety pins, the shoes with holes that let water seep through to my frozen toes, the 3-day stubble that made me look like I belonged anywhere but in her pristine establishment. She set down the glass with a decisive clink and crossed her arms over her crisp uniform, her name tag reading Sarah in bold letters that seemed to judge me from across the room. "We don't serve your kind here," she said, her voice cutting through the gentle murmur of conversation from the handful of customers scattered throughout the diner, each word delivered with the precision of someone who had practiced this speech before, who had looked at people like me and decided we were unworthy of basic human decency. My stomach growled audibly, reminding me that I hadn't eaten in 36 hours, that the $23 crumpled in my pocket represented everything I owned in this world, that I was just a man who needed a hot meal and a moment of warmth before facing the brutal night ahead. The other patrons had turned to stare now, some with curiosity, others with disgust, their forks suspended halfway to their mouths as if my presence had somehow contaminated their dining experience. "I have money," I said quietly, pulling the bills from my pocket and smoothing them on the counter, the wet paper leaving dark spots on the pristine surface, evidence of my desperation laid bare for everyone to see. Sarah's laugh was sharp and bitter, like glass breaking in the distance, and she shook her head with theatrical disdain that seemed performed for the benefit of her audience, a woman playing to the crowd's expectations of how one should treat society's unwanted. "Money or not, we reserve the right to refuse service to anyone, and I'm refusing you, so you can take your cash and find somewhere else to spend it." The shame burned hotter than hunger in my chest, spreading through my ribs like fire as I stood there dripping on her clean floor, my reflection in the window showing a man who had lost everything except his dignity, and now they wanted to take that too. I had been a different person 6 months ago, wearing expensive suits and eating in restaurants far fancier than this humble diner, but life has a way of stripping away everything you think defines you until you're left standing in the rain with nothing but your name and the hope that tomorrow might be kinder than today. The other customers had returned to their meals now, the show apparently over, the entertainment value of my humiliation exhausted as they went back to their conversations about weather and work and weekend plans, their comfortable lives insulated from the harsh realities that waited just outside these warm walls. I turned toward the door, my hand already reaching for the handle when the bell chimed again, announcing another arrival into this theater of casual cruelty. The man who entered was tall and distinguished, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the rain, his wool coat expensive but not ostentatious, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being recognized and respected. He paused in the doorway, taking in the scene with intelligent gray eyes that seemed to catalog every detail, from my defeated posture to Sarah's defiant stance behind the counter, the tension in the air as thick as the storm clouds outside. "Michael," he said, and my name spoken in his warm baritone voice made me freeze with my hand still on the door handle, because nobody in this town should know who I am, nobody should recognize the man I used to be beneath the layers of misfortune and despair that had become my disguise. I turned slowly, afraid to hope, afraid to believe that someone in this place might see me as more than just another homeless nuisance to be swept away like debris after a storm, and found myself looking into the face of Mayor Jonathan Hartwell, a man I had known in what felt like another lifetime, when I wore suits instead of rags and commanded respect instead of inspiring pity. His face broke into a genuine smile, the kind that reaches the eyes and transforms the entire expression, and before I could process what was happening, he crossed the distance between us in 3 quick strides and pulled me into an embrace that smelled of expensive cologne and human kindness, his arms strong and sure around my trembling shoulders as if I were a long-lost brother rather than a vagrant who had just been refused service. The diner fell silent except for the gentle patter of rain against windows and the soft jazz playing from hidden speakers, every conversation stopping mid-sentence as the most powerful man in the city hugged the person they had just dismissed as worthless trash, the contradiction so stark that it seemed to bend reality itself around this moment of unexpected grace. "I've been looking for you everywhere," Mayor Hartwell said, pulling back to look at me with eyes that held genuine concern and what might have been relief, his hands still resting on my shoulders as if afraid I might disappear again into the maze of streets and alleys where I had been hiding from my past and my shame. Sarah's mouth had fallen open behind the counter, her confident superiority crumbling like sand castles before an incoming tide as she realized she had just refused service to the mayor's friend, that her casual cruelty had been witnessed by someone who could end her employment with a single phone call. The other patrons were staring openly now, their forks forgotten entirely as they tried to process this dramatic reversal of fortune, this fairy tale moment playing out in their ordinary Tuesday evening. "You know him," Sarah stammered, not quite a question but not quite a statement, her voice smaller now, uncertain in a way that made her seem younger and more vulnerable, as if the uniform and attitude had been armor that was now cracking under the weight of her mistake. "Know him," Mayor Hartwell repeated, his voice carrying the authority of his office as he turned to address the room, his arms still around my shoulders in a gesture of protection and solidarity that sent warmth flooding through my chest for the first time in months. "This man is Michael Chen, one of the finest architects this city has ever seen, the man who designed the children's hospital that has saved countless lives, the community center where your kids learn to read, the affordable housing complex that gives families hope for a better future." The words hit the room like thunder, each achievement from my former life landing with the force of revelation as faces around the diner transformed from disgust to recognition to something approaching shame, because now they had to confront the reality that they had dismissed a human being based on nothing more than appearances, that their comfortable assumptions about worth and value had been shattered by the simple act of seeing me as more than my circumstances. I wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor and escape this moment of exposure that felt more vulnerable than any night I had spent sleeping under bridges or in abandoned buildings, because at least in the darkness I could pretend that my fall from grace was temporary, that someday I might reclaim the respect I had earned through years of hard work and dedication to making this city a better place for everyone who called it home. But Mayor Hartwell's grip on my shoulder remained firm, anchoring me to this moment of reckoning that I had been avoiding for 6 months, ever since the night when everything I had built came crashing down around me like a house of cards in a hurricane, when I discovered that the construction company I had trusted with my designs had been cutting corners with substandard materials, putting lives at risk to pad their profit margins. The investigation had been swift and merciless, my name dragged through newspapers and television reports as regulators tried to determine whether I had been complicit in the corruption or merely naive, whether my signature on those approval documents made me a criminal or just another victim of corporate greed. The truth was complex and nuanced, lost in the court of public opinion where guilt by association was verdict enough to destroy a career built over 2 decades of honest work and genuine care for the communities I served. My architecture firm had collapsed within weeks, clients fleeing like rats from a sinking ship as my reputation burned in the media firestorm, my savings drained by legal fees and the mortgage on a house I could no longer afford, my wife leaving with our daughter when the stress became too much and the future looked too uncertain to risk staying for whatever came next. The isolation had been the worst part, watching friends cross the street to avoid awkward conversations, professional colleagues suddenly too busy to return phone calls, the slow realization that everything I thought was solid in my life had been built on foundations as fragile as morning frost. "The investigation cleared you completely," Mayor Hartwell continued, his voice carrying across the silent diner like a proclamation, addressing not just the patrons but speaking directly to me, reminding me of truths I had been too ashamed and too broken to fully accept. "The corruption was exposed, the guilty parties are serving prison sentences, and your designs were found to be flawless, your integrity beyond question. But by then the damage to your reputation had been done and you had disappeared before we could set the record straight." The words washed over me like absolution, like rain after a drought, filling spaces in my soul that had been empty and aching for so long that I had forgotten what hope felt like, what it meant to be seen as something other than a failure and a cautionary tale about hubris and misplaced trust. Tears began to blur my vision, hot and healing as they traced paths down my cheeks, carrying months of accumulated grief and self-doubt and bitter regret toward some kind of redemption I had thought was lost forever. Sarah had moved closer during the mayor's speech, her earlier hostility replaced by something that looked like dawning horror as she realized the magnitude of her mistake, that she had treated a pillar of the community like garbage simply because his current circumstances didn't match her expectations of what success should look like. Her hand trembled as she reached for a coffee cup, filling it with steaming liquid that smelled like warmth and welcome, like the kindness she should have offered from the beginning. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, setting the cup before me with reverence usually reserved for religious ceremonies, her eyes bright with unshed tears as she confronted her own capacity for casual cruelty, the way she had dehumanized a stranger based on nothing more than appearances and assumptions. The coffee was perfect, hot and strong and exactly what I needed, but more than that was the gesture itself, the acknowledgement that I deserved basic human dignity regardless of my circumstances, that my value as a person wasn't determined by the clothes I wore or the address where I slept at night. Other patrons were approaching now, drawn by curiosity and perhaps by guilt, wanting to be part of this story of redemption rather than the earlier chapter of rejection and shame. An elderly woman with kind eyes and gentle hands placed a plate of food before me, roast beef and mashed potatoes and green beans that steamed in the warm air, comfort food that spoke of care and nourishment and the fundamental human act of feeding someone who was hungry. A young man in work clothes pushed a $20 bill across the counter, insisting I keep it for whatever I might need, his calloused hands telling stories of honest labor and the dignity that comes from working with your hands to build something meaningful. "Where have you been staying?" Mayor Hartwell asked gently, sitting beside me at the counter as if we were old friends catching up over dinner rather than a public official rescuing a fallen colleague from the depths of despair, his presence somehow making the simple act of eating feel less like charity and more like communion. The truth was complicated and embarrassing, a tale of sleeping in my car until it was repossessed, then moving to shelters when they had space, finally to the streets and abandoned buildings when pride and paperwork made official help too difficult to navigate, the bureaucratic maze of social services somehow harder to negotiate than the physical challenges of homelessness itself. I had become expert at finding warm grates in dry doorways, at avoiding police sweeps and territorial disputes among others who lived in the shadows, at becoming invisible in a city where I had once been recognized and respected. "Here and there," I said finally, not wanting to burden him with the details of how far I had fallen, how many nights I had stared at the stars through broken windows and wondered if this was how my story was meant to end, if the boy who had dreamed of building beautiful things had always been destined to become just another casualty of circumstances beyond his control. Mayor Hartwell nodded with understanding that suggested he knew more about my situation than he was letting on, that perhaps my disappearance hadn't been as complete as I had imagined, that there were people in this city who had been keeping track of one of their own even when he was too proud or too broken to ask for help. "We have a proposition for you," he said, and something in his tone made me look up from my plate, made me meet his eyes despite the vulnerability I felt in this moment of exposure and possibility, because propositions implied futures and I had stopped believing in tomorrows that might be better than today. The diner had gradually returned to normal conversation, though I could feel curious glances still coming my way, people stealing looks at the man who had been transformed from pariah to person of interest by the simple act of recognition and human kindness, the way a single moment of grace could rewrite an entire narrative of shame and isolation. "The city council has been discussing a new project," Mayor Hartwell continued, his voice taking on the measured tone of someone presenting official business, though his eyes remained warm and personal, treating me as a professional equal despite my current appearance and circumstances. "A memorial park to honor the victims of last year's factory fire, something that speaks to our community's resilience and commitment to never letting such a tragedy happen again." The factory fire had been front-page news for weeks, a horrific industrial accident that claimed 17 lives and left dozens more injured, families destroyed by preventable negligence and corporate cost-cutting that put profits above human safety, a story that resonated painfully with my own experience of how greed and corruption could devastate innocent lives. "We want you to design it," he said simply, the words landing between us like a bridge across the chasm that separated my past achievements from my current struggles, an offer that represented far more than just employment but a chance at redemption, at proving that my value as a person wasn't diminished by the misfortunes that had befallen me. My hands began to shake as the implications of his offer settled into my consciousness, because this wasn't just a job but a return to purpose, a chance to use my skills and training and passion for something meaningful again, to create beauty and meaning from tragedy and loss in the way that only architecture can accomplish when it reaches beyond mere function toward art and healing. "I don't have an office anymore," I said, the practical reality of my situation asserting itself even as hope began to bloom in my chest, because how could I take on such an important project without the infrastructure and resources that professional architecture required, without computers and drafting tables and all the tools that had once been as familiar as extensions of my own hands? "The city will provide everything you need," Mayor Hartwell replied, his voice matter-of-fact as if such arrangements were commonplace rather than extraordinary acts of faith in someone society had written off as finished, done, no longer worth the investment of hope or resources. "Office space, equipment, whatever support staff you require, and of course a salary commensurate with the project's importance and your own considerable expertise." Sarah had been listening to our conversation while pretending to clean glasses, her earlier shame now transformed into something that looked like wonder, as if she was witnessing a real-life fairy tale where kindness triumphed over prejudice and second chances were offered to those who needed them most, where the arc of justice bent toward redemption rather than punishment. "There's more," Mayor Hartwell said, and I could hear barely contained excitement in his voice, the enthusiasm of someone about to share particularly good news, the kind of moment that changes lives and rewrites destinies with the power of human generosity and institutional support. "The Memorial Park is just the beginning, the first project in what we're hoping will be a comprehensive urban renewal initiative, affordable housing and community centers and green spaces that will transform the most neglected parts of our city into places where families can thrive and children can dream about futures filled with possibility." The scope of what he was describing took my breath away, because this wasn't just one project but a career's worth of meaningful work, the kind of comprehensive planning and design that could reshape a community for generations, that could turn forgotten neighborhoods into thriving centers of life and hope and human connection, the very reason I had fallen in love with architecture in the first place. "Why me?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer, could see it in the way he looked at me with respect and recognition despite my current circumstances, because he was offering me this opportunity not in spite of what I had been through but because of it, because someone who had experienced loss and hardship and the fragility of human dignity would bring a different perspective to designing spaces meant to shelter and nurture and inspire. "Because you understand what it means to lose everything and still keep going," he said, his words simple but weighted with truth, acknowledging the journey I had traveled from success to failure to this moment of unexpected grace, the wisdom that comes only through suffering and the compassion that grows from personal experience of how quickly life can change. "Because your designs have always been about more than just buildings, they've been about creating spaces where people can flourish, and we need someone who remembers what it feels like to need shelter from the storm." The conversation around us had faded to background noise as the full implications of his offer settled into my understanding, because this was more than just a job offer, it was a recognition that my value as a human being transcended my current circumstances, that my skills and knowledge and passion for creating beautiful, functional spaces remained intact despite the external trappings of success having been stripped away by forces beyond my control. "When would you want me to start?" I heard myself asking, the words coming out stronger than I felt, carrying hope I hadn't dared to embrace for months, the possibility that tomorrow might indeed be different from today, that the long fall from grace might finally be over and the slow climb back toward meaning and purpose could begin. "Tonight, if you're willing," Mayor Hartwell replied with a smile that transformed his distinguished features into something boyish and enthusiastic, as if he had been waiting for this moment as long as I had been dreading it, as if my redemption was as important to him as it was to me. "We have temporary housing arranged at the Riverside Hotel, nothing fancy but clean and warm and private, and the project materials are already waiting in your new office, architectural surveys and site plans and all the preliminary work our planning department has completed." The hotel he mentioned was a respectable establishment downtown, the kind of place where business travelers stayed and conferences were held, worlds away from the shelters and abandoned buildings that had been my home for these past months, the prospect of clean sheets and hot showers and a door that locked from the inside seeming almost too good to believe. Sarah had set another cup of coffee before me without being asked, this one accompanied by a slice of apple pie that smelled like cinnamon and comfort, like the domestic kindness I had forgotten existed in a world that had seemed determined to punish me for crimes I hadn't committed, for trusting the wrong people with projects that mattered too much to be corrupted by greed and negligence. The pie was homemade and perfect, each bite carrying flavors that reminded me of holidays and family gatherings and all the simple pleasures that make life worth living, the taste of hope and normalcy after months of surviving on whatever charity or circumstance provided, of eating from garbage cans and food banks and the brutal calculus of making every dollar stretch toward tomorrow. "There's something else you should know," Mayor Hartwell said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone that made me look up from my plate, made me prepare for whatever complication or condition might be attached to this miraculous opportunity, because experience had taught me that nothing this good comes without some hidden cost or unexpected requirement. "The construction company that caused your original problems, Morrison and Associates, they've been trying to win the bid for this memorial project," he continued, and I felt my stomach drop as the implications became clear, because of course they would be involved. Of course the very people whose corruption had destroyed my career would now be positioned to profit from my return to architecture, the cosmic irony sharp enough to cut. "The city council meeting to approve the final contractor selection is tomorrow night," he said, watching my face carefully as he delivered this news, perhaps looking for signs that I might not be ready for this confrontation, that facing my past might be too much after everything I had been through. If you're going to be the project architect, you'll need to be there. You'll need to stand up and make the case for choosing a different contractor, one with the integrity and competence this project deserves. The thought of facing Morrison and Associates in a public forum, of being in the same room with the people whose greed and negligence had cost me everything I had worked to build, made my hands shake and my breathing shallow, because I had spent months trying to forget the betrayal and humiliation, trying to bury the anger that threatened to consume what little peace I had managed to find in my exile from normal life. But alongside the fear was something else, something that felt like anticipation and possibility, because this was a chance not just for personal redemption but for justice, for ensuring that the memorial to those factory fire victims would be built with the integrity and care they deserved, not corrupted by the same forces that had caused so much tragedy and loss already. "I'll be there," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice, by the conviction that seemed to rise from some reservoir of strength I hadn't known still existed after everything that had tried to break me, the determination that had driven me to become an architect in the first place, to build things that would outlast their creator and serve generations yet to come. Mayor Hartwell smiled and clasped my shoulder again, the gesture conveying approval and support and something that felt like paternal pride, as if my willingness to face this challenge had confirmed something he had hoped to find in me, some essential quality that hadn't been destroyed by months of hardship and humiliation. The diner was beginning to empty as the dinner hour wound down, but several patrons stopped by our table on their way out, offering quiet words of encouragement and support, expressing shame for their earlier assumptions and hope for my success on the memorial project, small gestures of human connection that helped heal wounds I hadn't even realized were still bleeding. Sarah approached as we prepared to leave, her earlier confidence replaced by genuine humility and what looked like determination to make amends for her earlier behavior, her young face serious as she struggled to find words adequate to the moment and the magnitude of her mistake. "I want you to know that what happened here tonight, it changed something in me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of genuine transformation, the kind of recognition that comes when someone sees themselves clearly for the first time and doesn't like what they discover. "I've been working here for 3 years, and I realize now how many people I've probably treated badly just because they didn't look like they belonged, how much cruelty I've disguised as policy and procedure." Her words hung in the air between us, honest and painful and necessary, because real change requires acknowledgement of harm done, requires looking directly at the ways we've failed to see the humanity in others, the casual violence of dismissing someone's worth based on appearance or circumstance or our own fears and prejudices. "We all make mistakes," I said, meaning it, because my own journey through loss and hardship had taught me something about the fragility of the pedestals we build for ourselves, how quickly fortune can change and how little separates any of us from the desperation I had been living with for months. "What matters is what we do after we recognize them." She nodded eagerly, tears bright in her eyes as she pressed something into my hand, a folded piece of paper that turned out to be her phone number written in careful script, along with a note that said simply, "Call me if you ever need anything." I mean that, anything at all. The kind of offer that comes from someone who has genuinely learned something about compassion and wants to practice it in the world. Mayor Hartwell had been making quiet phone calls while Sarah and I talked, arranging details for my housing and office setup, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making things happen quickly and efficiently, transforming possibility into reality through the application of political will and institutional resources. "The hotel is expecting you," he said as we stepped out into the night, the rain having finally stopped to reveal stars scattered across the clear sky like promises of better days ahead, the air fresh and clean in the way that only comes after storms have washed the world clean of accumulated dust and debris. His car was a modest sedan rather than the official vehicle I might have expected, another sign of the man's fundamental decency and lack of pretension, his understanding that true leadership comes not from symbols of power but from the willingness to serve others, to see potential where others see only problems, to offer second chances when society would rather write people off as lost causes. The drive to the hotel was quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts as the city rolled past the windows, familiar streets taking on new significance now that I was seeing them not as a homeless wanderer trying to survive another night but as an architect once again, someone with the skills and opportunity to shape these spaces into something better, more beautiful, more conducive to human flourishing. "There's a breakfast meeting tomorrow at 8, he said as we pulled up to the hotel's entrance, the lobby visible through glass doors looking warm and welcoming, a return to the world of normal life and normal expectations after months of existing on society's margins. "Nothing formal, just you and me and the planning committee," a chance to review the project materials and discuss your vision for the memorial before tomorrow night's council meeting. The hotel clerk recognized Mayor Hartwell immediately, greeting him with the respectful deference accorded to local dignitaries, but treating me with professional courtesy despite my disheveled appearance, as if mayors brought homeless men to check into hotels every day, as if such unusual circumstances were simply part of the normal flow of business. My room was on the 4th floor, clean and comfortable and absolutely ordinary in the most extraordinary way, because ordinary had become foreign to me after months of uncertainty and improvisation, of never knowing where I would sleep or whether tomorrow would bring food or shelter or simple human kindness. The shower was hot and lasted as long as I wanted, washing away months of accumulated grime and desperation, the steam carrying with it the smell of streets and alleys and the particular odor that comes from living without regular access to soap and clean water and the basic amenities that most people take for granted. I stood under the spray until the water began to cool, letting it run over my face and through my hair, baptizing me back into the world of possibility and hope. The reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a man I barely recognized, thinner than before and marked by experience, but with something in the eyes that looked like determination, like the spark that had originally driven me to architecture hadn't been extinguished by everything that had tried to smother it, that somewhere beneath the accumulated damage was still the person who believed buildings could change lives and communities could be transformed through thoughtful design. The bed was soft and the sheets were clean, and for the first time in months I fell asleep without wondering whether I would be safe until morning, without the hypervigilance that comes from sleeping rough, without the constant low-level anxiety that had become as familiar as breathing, just peaceful darkness and the luxury of knowing I could rest without fear. I woke before dawn, my body still accustomed to the rhythms of street life where early rising often meant the difference between finding breakfast and going hungry, between claiming a warm spot before others arrived and spending the day cold and uncomfortable, habits that would take time to unlearn now that safety and security had been restored to my life. The clothes Mayor Hartwell had arranged were waiting outside my door, simple but well made, appropriate for a professional meeting and properly sized, as if someone had taken the time to estimate my measurements and select items that would help me look the part of a successful architect rather than a man rebuilding his life from nothing. The breakfast meeting was held in a private dining room at the hotel, Mayor Hartwell already seated at a table spread with architectural plans and site surveys, coffee and pastries arranged alongside the technical documents in a way that suggested this was both business and hospitality, both professional consultation and personal welcome back to the world of meaningful work. The planning committee consisted of 3 people besides the mayor, each bringing different expertise to the memorial project, their enthusiasm for the work evident in the way they leaned forward as they spoke, their genuine investment in creating something worthy of the victims they were honoring and the community that had been scarred by preventable tragedy. Dar. Elizabeth Martinez was the city's chief urban planner, a woman in her 50s with intelligent eyes and calloused hands that spoke of someone who had worked her way up through practical experience rather than just academic credentials, her questions about the memorial's integration with existing neighborhood infrastructure showing deep understanding of how individual projects fit into larger urban systems. James Wu represented the families of the factory fire victims, his quiet dignity masking what must have been enormous grief, his soft-spoken suggestions about incorporating elements that would honor not just the dead but the survivors and the community's resilience in the face of tragedy, the way collective trauma could become collective strength if channeled through appropriate memorialization. Patricia Santos was the director of the city's Parks and Recreation Department, her expertise in landscape design and community programming essential for ensuring that the memorial would be not just a place to remember the past but a space where families could gather and children could play and life could continue in all its messy, beautiful complexity. The site they had selected was perfect, a vacant lot in the heart of the neighborhood where the factory had stood, visible from the main street but set back enough to provide quiet space for reflection and remembrance, large enough to accommodate both memorial elements and community activities, positioned to become a focal point for renewal and growth rather than a monument to loss and despair. As they spread out the site plans and aerial photographs, I felt something stirring in my chest that had been dormant for months, the particular excitement that comes when architectural problems begin to resolve themselves in my mind, when the combination of site and purpose and client need starts to suggest solutions that are both practical and beautiful, both functional and meaningful. "What are you thinking, Dr. Martinez asked, watching my face as I studied the documents, perhaps seeing something in my expression that indicated the mental machinery of design was beginning to turn again, that the architect was awakening after his long sleep in the wilderness of despair and self-doubt. "Water," I said, the word coming from some deep place of intuition before my conscious mind had fully processed the implications, but knowing immediately that it was right, that water would be central to whatever we created here, water as symbol and substance, as memory and healing, as the fundamental element that makes life possible. The factory fire had been caused by inadequate sprinkler systems, corners cut on safety equipment to maximize profits, so water would honor the victims by being present where it had been absent, protection where there had been negligence, the simple element that might have saved lives if greed hadn't been valued above human safety. But water would also be life and renewal, the sound of fountains and streams creating spaces for quiet contemplation, reflecting pools that would mirror sky and clouds and the faces of those who came to remember, interactive features where children could play and families could gather, because grief and joy often occupy the same spaces and healing requires both remembrance and continuation of life. James nodded slowly as I began to sketch preliminary ideas on the back of a napkin, rough shapes that suggested flowing forms and organic integration with the landscape, spaces that would invite rather than intimidate, that would speak to loss without wallowing in despair, that would honor the dead by celebrating the vitality of the living community. The families have talked about wanting something that feels alive, he said, his voice carrying the weight of conversations with parents and spouses and children who had lost people they loved, who needed their grief acknowledged but not enshrined, who wanted to remember without being trapped in permanent sorrow. Not just a statue or a plaque, but something that changes with the seasons, that brings people together instead of just making them sad. The ideas were coming faster now, connections forming between function and symbol, between memorial purpose and community need, the kind of synthetic thinking that had always been my strength as an architect, the ability to hold multiple requirements in creative tension until solutions emerged that satisfied all constituencies while transcending any single agenda. Patricia Santos was making notes as I talked, her questions about maintenance and programming helping ground the visionary elements in practical reality, because beautiful spaces that can't be sustained become ugly spaces that disappoint and discourage, that fail in their primary mission of serving the community over time rather than just impressing visitors at the grand opening. By the end of the breakfast meeting, we had the skeleton of a concept that excited everyone at the table, a memorial park that would center around a series of terraced water features cascading down a gentle slope, creating multiple spaces for different kinds of activities and reflection, integrated with native plantings that would provide year-round beauty and habitat for birds and small animals, pathways that would accommodate both wheelchairs and baby strollers, lighting that would make the space safe and welcoming after dark. "This is exactly what we hoped for," Mayor Hartwell said as we gathered up the plans and prepared to head to City Hall for the day's normal business, his satisfaction evident in the way he smiled and moved, as if a burden he'd been carrying had been lifted by the morning's productive collaboration. "Now we just have to get through tonight's council meeting and make sure the right contractor gets selected to build it." The reminder of evening's confrontation brought my anxiety rushing back, because facing Morrison and Associates would require a different kind of courage than designing memorial parks, would demand that I stand up in public and recount the story of their corruption and my own downfall, that I make myself vulnerable to their counterattacks and whatever political influence they might wield. But alongside the fear was something that felt like anticipation, because this was a chance not just for personal vindication but for justice, for ensuring that the memorial to factory fire victims wouldn't be corrupted by the same forces that had caused so much damage already, that quality and integrity would triumph over cost-cutting and corner-cutting and the brutal mathematics of maximizing profit at any cost. The day passed in a blur of meetings and phone calls and detailed review of contractor proposals, my temporary office in City Hall equipped with everything I needed to analyze technical specifications and cost estimates, to prepare the presentation that would convince the council to reject Morrison and Associates in favor of Hartwell Construction, a smaller local firm with an impeccable reputation for quality work and ethical business practices. The irony wasn't lost on me that the mayor and the construction company shared a name, though they weren't related, just one of those coincidences that seems meaningful until you realize that most small cities have multiple families with the same surnames, that correlation isn't causation and shared names don't necessarily indicate shared values or interests. Sarah from the diner called during the afternoon, her voice nervous but determined as she asked if there was anything she could do to help, any way she could support me in tonight's council meeting, her offer of assistance touching in its sincerity even though there was nothing practical she could contribute to what was essentially a technical and political process. "Just knowing you're thinking of me helps," I told her, meaning it, because kindness from unexpected sources had become one of the few reliable sources of strength in my life, proof that human decency persisted even in a world that often seemed designed to reward selfishness and punish vulnerability. Other calls came throughout the day, former colleagues who had heard about my involvement in the memorial project and wanted to express support, professional contacts who had maintained faith in my abilities even when I had lost faith in myself, voices from my past life reaching across the months of silence and isolation to remind me that I hadn't been as forgotten as I had believed. The most surprising call came from Detective Sarah Rodriguez, the investigator who had led the corruption probe that had initially destroyed my career, her voice warm and apologetic as she explained that she had been trying to reach me for months to share information that had emerged during the ongoing investigation of Morrison and Associates. "We found evidence that they deliberately targeted you," she said, her words carrying the weight of official authority and personal regret, because law enforcement officers understand better than most how justice delayed can become justice denied, how the wheels of bureaucracy often turn too slowly to prevent collateral damage. Internal emails showing they knew their corner cutting would eventually be discovered, that they needed a prominent architect to serve as a scapegoat when the investigations began. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, because it meant my downfall hadn't been accidental collateral damage but deliberate manipulation, that Morrison and Associates had calculated from the beginning that my reputation and career were acceptable sacrifices to protect their own interests when their corruption was inevitably exposed. "They forged documents to make it appear you had approved specifications you never saw," Detective Rodriguez continued, her voice careful and professional as she delivered information that reframed everything I thought I knew about my own story, that transformed me from unwitting accomplice to deliberate victim. "Your electronic signature was copied and pasted onto approval forms that were backdated to suggest you had signed off on the substandard materials they used in multiple projects. The computer forensics had taken months to complete," she explained, "because Morrison and Associates had sophisticated systems for covering their tracks, because corporate corruption investigations require painstaking analysis of digital evidence that often takes years to fully unravel, because the wealthy and powerful have resources to make their crimes difficult to detect and prosecute. The district attorney wants to meet with you tomorrow," she said, and I could hear something like excitement in her voice, the satisfaction of a detective who had finally assembled enough evidence to bring down criminals who had thought themselves untouchable. "They're preparing additional charges against Morrison and Associates, conspiracy and fraud and obstruction of justice, and your testimony could be crucial to securing convictions." The prospect of testifying against the people who had destroyed my life was both terrifying and exhilarating, because it represented not just personal vindication but the possibility of preventing them from victimizing others, of ensuring that their corruption wouldn't claim any more innocent casualties like myself or the factory workers who had died because safety systems had been compromised. But first I had to get through tonight's council meeting, had to stand up in public and make the case for integrity and quality in the memorial project, had to face down the very people who had manipulated me into taking the blame for their crimes, who had calculated that my shame and isolation would prevent me from fighting back against their lies and misdirection. The council chambers were packed when I arrived that evening, more crowded than usual because the memorial project had captured public attention, because people wanted to be part of honoring the factory fire victims and ensuring that their deaths weren't forgotten or minimized by time and political expedience. Mayor Hartwell was already at the podium when I entered, reviewing the evening's agenda with the 5 council members, his voice carrying the authority of someone comfortable with public speaking and political process, someone who understood how to navigate the formal procedures that govern municipal decision-making. Morrison and Associates had brought a full team to the meeting, 3 men in expensive suits who radiated the confidence of people accustomed to winning government contracts through a combination of competitive bidding and political influence, their presence in the front row a reminder that tonight's decision would have significant financial implications for whoever was selected. I recognized Thomas Morrison immediately, the company's founder and CEO, a man in his 60s whose silver hair and distinguished bearing masked the corruption that had destroyed so many lives, whose public reputation as a pillar of the business community had provided perfect cover for years of systematic fraud and negligence. He looked directly at me as I found a seat near the back of the room, his expression unreadable but somehow conveying both recognition and dismissal, as if I were a minor annoyance that had been dealt with months ago and posed no serious threat to his current objectives, as if my presence at tonight's meeting was merely a pathetic attempt to reclaim relevance that had been permanently lost. The formal presentation of contractor proposals took nearly an hour, each company allotted 15 minutes to present their qualifications and approach to the memorial project, their slides and charts and cost estimates projected on screens that made the technical details visible to the packed audience. Hartwell Construction went first, their presentation focused on quality craftsmanship and community partnership, examples of previous work that demonstrated attention to detail and commitment to honoring the spirit of each project rather than just meeting minimum specifications. Their bids slightly higher than Morrison and Associates but justified by superior materials and construction methods. Morrison and Associates followed with a slick presentation that emphasized cost savings and efficiency. Their lower bid prominently featured as evidence of fiscal responsibility and respect for taxpayer dollars. Their track record of completing projects on time and under budget presented as proof of superior management and project control. What they didn't mention, what wouldn't be visible to casual observers, were the shortcuts and compromises that made their lower costs possible, the systematic corner cutting that had been exposed in the investigation but hadn't yet resulted in public consequences, the pattern of prioritizing profit margins over public safety that had contributed to the very tragedy the memorial was meant to honor. When the presentations were complete, Mayor Hartwell opened the floor for public comment, reminding speakers that they had 3 minutes each to address the council, that personal attacks wouldn't be tolerated, that the focus should remain on what was best for the community and the memorial project. Several family members of factory fire victims spoke first, their voices carrying the weight of personal loss as they urged the council to prioritize quality and safety over cost savings, to ensure that the memorial would be built with the same care and attention they wished had been applied to the factory's safety systems. James Wu was among them, his quiet dignity compelling as he reminded the council that the memorial wasn't just another construction project but a sacred trust, an opportunity to demonstrate that the community had learned from tragedy and was committed to preventing similar losses in the future. "We're not asking for the most expensive option," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion underlying his words, "but we are asking for the most reliable one, the contractor who will honor our loved ones by doing the work right the first time, who won't cut corners or compromise on quality to increase their profit margins." Business leaders and community activists also spoke, some supporting Morrison and Associates based on their track record of cost control, others arguing that the memorial deserved the highest quality construction regardless of price, that some things were too important to be decided solely on financial considerations. The debate continued for nearly an hour, perspectives and arguments filling the council chambers with the sound of democracy in action, citizens engaging with their local government on an issue that mattered to them, the messy but essential process of collective decision-making playing out in real time. Finally, Mayor Hartwell called my name, his voice carrying across the crowded room as conversations died and attention focused on the man who had been homeless just 24 hours earlier, who was now preparing to stand up in public and confront the people who had destroyed his previous life. My legs felt unsteady as I walked to the podium, hyper-aware of the eyes following my movement, of Morrison and his associates leaning forward with interest and perhaps concern, of the family members who had spoken earlier watching with hope and support, of Sarah from the diner who had somehow managed to attend despite working the dinner shift. "My name is Michael Chin," I began, my voice stronger than I had expected, carrying clearly through the sound system to reach every corner of the packed room, "and 6 months ago I was one of the most respected architects in this city, until Morrison and Associates destroyed my career to cover up their own corruption." A murmur ran through the audience, conversations and whispers as people processed this unexpected development, this dramatic revelation that transformed the evening's proceedings from routine municipal business into something approaching courtroom drama, personal testimony that added human stakes to technical discussions of construction contracts. Thomas Morrison was on his feet immediately, his face flushed with anger and what might have been panic, his voice raised in objection as he demanded that I be prevented from making what he called unsubstantiated allegations and personal attacks, that the council restrict discussion to relevant qualifications rather than allowing what he characterized as desperate character assassination. Mayor Hartwell gavelled for order, his voice calm but firm as he reminded everyone that public comment would be conducted according to established rules, that speakers would be allowed to complete their remarks without interruption, that rebuttals and clarifications could be offered during the appropriate portions of the meeting. As I was saying, I continued, making eye contact with each council member in turn, establishing the personal connection that makes testimony credible and compelling, that transforms abstract policy discussions into human stories with real consequences. Morrison and Associates systematically used substandard materials and falsified inspection reports on multiple projects, including some that I designed. The details spilled out in careful sequence, each revelation building on the previous one to create a comprehensive picture of corporate corruption and deliberate malfeasance, the forged signatures and backdated documents and systematic cover-ups that had been exposed by the police investigation, the evidence that proved I had been scapegoated rather than complicit. The factory fire that killed 17 people, I said, my voice dropping to carry the weight of this central tragedy, the event that had brought us all together in this room tonight. That fire spread as quickly as it did because Morrison and Associates cut corners on the sprinkler system, because they used cheaper materials that failed when they were needed most, because profit margins mattered more to them than human lives. The room had fallen completely silent now, the only sounds coming from the ventilation system and the occasional scrape of a chair as someone shifted position, the atmosphere thick with tension and the recognition that tonight's decision carried implications far beyond construction contracts and municipal budgets. Detective Rodriguez is in the audience tonight, I continued, gesturing toward the back of the room where I could see the investigator who had called me earlier, her presence lending official weight to my accusations, and she can confirm that Morrison and Associates are facing additional criminal charges based on evidence discovered during the ongoing investigation. Thomas Morrison was speaking urgently to his associates now, their heads bent together in whispered conference that suggested panic and damage control, the realization that their carefully constructed public image was crumbling in real time, that years of successful manipulation and misdirection were being undone by a single evening's testimony. The choice before you tonight, I concluded, returning my attention to the council members who would ultimately decide between the competing contractors, is whether to award this memorial contract to a company with a proven track record of integrity and quality, or to the same company whose corruption and negligence contributed to the deaths we're supposed to be honoring with this memorial. The applause that followed was spontaneous and sustained, wave after wave of clapping that seemed to go on forever, expressions of support and approval from an audience that included family members of the victims, community leaders who had long suspected Morrison and Associates of questionable practices, ordinary citizens who were tired of seeing public contracts awarded based on political connections rather than merit and integrity. Mayor Hartwell had to gavel repeatedly for order, his calls for quiet gradually restoring the formal atmosphere appropriate for municipal government, though the energy in the room remained charged with emotion and the sense that something significant had just occurred, that the balance of power had shifted in ways that would have lasting consequences. Thomas Morrison demanded the right to respond, his voice tight with barely controlled anger as he characterized my testimony as the desperate lies of a disgraced professional trying to blame others for his own failures, his words carrying the practiced smoothness of someone accustomed to talking his way out of difficult situations through a combination of charm and intimidation. But the damage had been done, the seeds of doubt planted in the minds of council members who were now seeing Morrison and Associates through the lens of criminal investigation rather than successful business partnership, who were beginning to understand that tonight's decision would be scrutinized far beyond the immediate circle of local politics and municipal governance. The council retired for executive session, their private deliberations lasting nearly 40 minutes while the audience waited in the chambers, conversations buzzing with excitement and speculation about which way the vote would go, whether the revelations about Morrison and Associates would be enough to overcome their political influence and cost advantages. When they returned, Mayor Hartwell's expression was grave but satisfied, carrying the demeanor of someone who had just participated in a difficult but necessary decision, who understood that tonight's vote would be remembered long after the memorial was completed and dedicated. By a vote of 4-1, he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet chamber, the Riverside City Council awards the Memorial Park construction contract to Hartwell Construction, contingent upon final approval of architectural plans and successful completion of all regulatory requirements. The eruption of applause was immediate and overwhelming, families of the victims rising to their feet in celebration, community members expressing approval and relief that integrity had triumphed over expediency, that the memorial would be built by people who shared their values and understood the sacred nature of the project. Thomas Morrison and his associates were already gathering their materials and heading for the exit, their faces grim with the recognition that they had suffered a significant defeat, that their reputation in the community had been damaged in ways that would take years to repair, if such repair was even possible given the ongoing criminal investigation. I remained at the podium for several minutes after the vote, accepting congratulations and expressions of support from people who approached to shake my hand or offer words of encouragement, their kindness a stark contrast to the rejection and dismissal I had experienced just 24 hours earlier in the diner. Sarah was among them, her young face bright with excitement and what looked like pride, as if she had played some role in the evening's triumph rather than simply witnessing it from the audience, her presence a reminder of how quickly human connections can form when people allow themselves to see past surface appearances to the person underneath. "You were amazing up there," she said, her voice filled with the enthusiasm of someone who had just witnessed something that restored her faith in justice and human decency. who had seen proof that courage and truth could triumph over wealth and influence when decent people were willing to stand up for what was right. Dar. Martinez approached with congratulations and technical documents, architectural surveys, and soil reports that would be needed for the detailed design phase, her professional demeanor softened by genuine warmth and what seemed like relief that the project would be guided by ethical considerations rather than just financial ones. James Wu was among the last to leave, his quiet gratitude more moving than all the applause and celebration, because his thanks carried the weight of personal loss and the hope that his family's tragedy might lead to something beautiful and meaningful, that the memorial would truly honor the people who had been lost while providing comfort and healing for those who remained. "You gave them back their dignity," he said simply, his words referring not just to the factory fire victims but to everyone who had been victimized by corruption and negligence, who had been dismissed as acceptable casualties in other people's pursuit of profit and power. The drive back to the hotel was quiet, both Mayor Hartwell and I lost in our own thoughts as the significance of the evening's events settled into our consciousness, the recognition that we had accomplished something important but that the real work was just beginning, that designing and building the memorial would require sustained effort and attention over many months. "How does it feel?" he asked as we pulled up to the hotel entrance, his question carrying multiple layers of meaning, referring not just to the evening's triumph but to the larger transformation that had occurred over the past day, the journey from despair to hope that had been compressed into such a short time frame. "Like I'm finally home," I answered, the words coming from somewhere deep and true, because home isn't just a place but a sense of belonging and purpose, a feeling of being valued and needed and connected to something larger than individual survival, exactly what had been missing during those long months of homelessness and isolation. The next morning brought new challenges and opportunities, beginning with the meeting with the district attorney that Detective Rodriguez had arranged, an opportunity to provide testimony that would help ensure Morrison and Associates faced appropriate consequences for their crimes, that justice would be served not just in the court of public opinion but in actual legal proceedings. The DA's office was located in the old courthouse downtown, its marble corridors and high ceilings speaking to the dignity and gravity of legal proceedings, the weight of institutional authority that would be brought to bear against corporate corruption and negligence, the power of the state to hold wealthy and influential people accountable for their actions. Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh was younger than I had expected, probably in her early 30s, but her questions were sharp and well-informed, her preparation evident in the way she guided our conversation through the technical details of architectural specifications and construction standards, the forensic evidence that would be crucial to securing convictions. "Your testimony will be particularly powerful," she explained, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who understood how to build compelling cases from complex evidence, because you can speak to both the technical aspects of the fraud and the human impact of their crimes, the way their corruption affected not just abstract building standards but real people's lives and livelihoods. The criminal trial was still months away, she warned, because corporate fraud cases required extensive preparation and careful coordination with federal authorities who were investigating Morrison and Associates for tax evasion and other financial crimes, but the additional charges based on Detective Rodriguez's investigation would significantly increase the potential penalties. "They're already facing bankruptcy," she said with satisfaction, because their bonding company has dropped them and their insurance carriers are refusing to renew their policies, and several of their ongoing projects have been suspended pending investigation of their construction methods. The news brought a sense of justice and closure that I hadn't expected to feel, because the desire for revenge had been complicated by my own sense of responsibility and shame, the way victims often internalize blame for crimes committed against them, the psychological impact of being scapegoated and abandoned by people who should have provided support. But alongside satisfaction was something that felt like sadness, because the destruction of Morrison and Associates would mean job losses for construction workers and administrative staff who had no involvement in the corruption, innocent people who would pay the price for their employers' crimes. The way corporate misconduct often has ripple effects that extend far beyond the immediate perpetrators. The afternoon was spent at my new office, which Mayor Hartwell had equipped with everything I needed to begin detailed design work on the memorial, computer workstations and drafting tables and the specialized software that had become essential tools of modern architectural practice, familiar equipment that felt like greeting old friends after months of separation. The preliminary sketches from yesterday's breakfast meeting had evolved into something more sophisticated and comprehensive during the night, my subconscious mind continuing to work on design problems even while I slept, generating solutions and refinements that surprised me with their elegance and appropriateness to the site and program. The central water feature would cascade down 3 levels, each representing a different aspect of the memorial's purpose, the top level dedicated to remembrance and reflection, with quiet seating areas and engraved stones listing the names of those who had been lost, a space for contemplation and grief and the private emotions that accompany loss. The middle level would focus on community and connection, with interactive water features where children could play and families could gather, because healing requires not just acknowledgement of loss but affirmation of continuing life, recognition that communities survive tragedy by supporting each other and maintaining hope for the future. The lowest level would celebrate resilience and renewal, with gardens and performance spaces and areas for community events, because memorials serve their highest purpose when they become places where people want to spend time, where positive experiences can coexist with solemn remembrance, where beauty emerges from tragedy. The design was ambitious but achievable, pushing the boundaries of what was possible within the available budget while remaining grounded in practical considerations of maintenance and programming, the kind of project that would establish new standards for memorial architecture while serving the specific needs of this particular community. Patricia Santos stopped by late in the afternoon to review the preliminary drawings, her expertise in landscape design helping refine the plant selections and grading plans that would integrate the memorial with its urban context, ensuring that the completed project would feel like a natural part of the neighborhood rather than an isolated monument. "This is going to be spectacular," she said, her enthusiasm genuine as she studied the detailed plans that had emerged from yesterday's rough sketches, the way architectural imagination could transform conceptual ideas into specific proposals for transforming real space. "People are going to come from all over the region to see this. It's going to put our city on the map for memorial design." The recognition was gratifying but secondary to the deeper satisfaction of creating something meaningful, something that would serve its community for generations, that would honor the dead while enriching the lives of the living, that would transform a site of tragedy into a place of beauty and hope and human connection. Sarah called during the evening to check on how the day had gone, her voice bright with curiosity and what sounded like genuine care, the kind of friendship that sometimes emerges from unexpected encounters, from moments when people see each other clearly and choose connection over separation, understanding over judgment. "I keep thinking about last night at the council meeting," she said, "how brave you were to stand up there and tell the truth, even when you knew it would be difficult and painful, even when you could have just stayed quiet and let someone else take the risk." Her words were more perceptive than I had expected, because courage isn't the absence of fear but action despite fear, the willingness to do what's right even when the personal cost might be high, the recognition that some things matter more than individual comfort or safety. "I learned something important from you," she continued, her voice thoughtful in the way that suggests someone is processing new understanding about themselves and the world, about not judging people based on appearances, about how much we can miss when we make assumptions about who deserves our kindness and respect. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, ranging from practical details about the memorial design to broader questions about justice and community and the responsibility we all have to look out for each other, the kind of discussion that happens when people discover they share values and perspectives despite very different life experiences. By the time we hung up, I realized that the isolation and loneliness that had been such a defining feature of my months on the streets had been replaced by something I had almost forgotten existed, a sense of connection and belonging that came not from professional achievement or social status but from human recognition and mutual care. The weeks that followed brought steady progress on the memorial design, detailed drawings, and specifications that would guide Hartwell Construction through the complex process of transforming architectural vision into physical reality, the collaboration between designer and builder that makes great projects possible. The groundbreaking ceremony was scheduled for the 6-month anniversary of the factory fire, a date that would honor the victims while marking the beginning of something hopeful and healing, the transformation of tragedy into beauty through the application of human creativity and community commitment. Mayor Hartwell insisted that I be the one to break ground, the architect whose vision would guide the project from conception to completion, whose own journey from despair to redemption paralleled the community's effort to find meaning and purpose in the aftermath of preventable loss. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of people, family members of the victims and city officials and ordinary citizens who had followed the project's development through newspaper coverage and word of mouth, their presence a reminder that public architecture belongs to everyone, that memorial spaces serve their highest purpose when they bring communities together. As I lifted the shovel and turned the first earth, I thought about all the people who had contributed to this moment, from Mayor Hartwell's initial recognition in the diner to Sarah's willingness to see past appearances to Detective Rodriguez's careful investigation that had exposed the truth about Morrison and Associates. But most of all I thought about the 17 people who had died in the factory fire, whose memories would be honored by this memorial park, whose families had trusted me to create something worthy of their loss and their love, something that would ensure their loved ones wouldn't be forgotten as time passed and immediate grief gave way to the longer process of healing and acceptance. The construction proceeded smoothly under Hartwell Construction's careful supervision, their commitment to quality evident in every detail of the work, from the precision of the stonework to the careful installation of the water circulation systems that would keep the fountains flowing year-round. I visited the site daily, watching the memorial take shape according to the plans we had developed, seeing architectural drawings transformed into three-dimensional reality through the skilled work of craftsmen who understood that they were building something more than just another construction project. The water features were particularly spectacular, the cascade system working exactly as designed to create multiple spaces for different kinds of activities and reflection, the sound of flowing water providing a peaceful backdrop that would make the memorial a refuge from urban noise and stress. The plantings were installed in early spring, native species selected for their ability to thrive in local climate conditions while providing year-round interest and habitat for wildlife, the landscape design integrating seamlessly with the architectural elements to create a unified vision of beauty and function. The memorial's dedication ceremony was held on a perfect May morning, clear skies and gentle breezes creating ideal conditions for the hundreds of people who had gathered to witness the official opening of what local newspapers were already calling a masterpiece of memorial architecture. James Wu spoke for the families of the victims, his words carrying the weight of grief transformed into gratitude, loss acknowledged and honored while affirming the resilience and hope that had made this memorial possible, the way communities can find healing through shared commitment to remembrance and renewal. "This memorial doesn't bring back the people we lost," he said, his voice steady and clear as it carried across the gathered crowd, "but it ensures they won't be forgotten, that their lives mattered, that their deaths led to something beautiful and meaningful that will serve our community for generations to come." Mayor Hartwell spoke about the importance of integrity in public projects, the way the memorial's creation had demonstrated that quality and ethical standards could triumph over cost-cutting and corner-cutting, that communities get the kind of leadership and governance they demand and deserve. When my turn came to address the gathering, I found myself thinking not about architectural details or design philosophy but about the journey that had brought me to this moment, the fall and redemption that had taught me something about the fragility and resilience of human dignity, the way hope can survive even the darkest circumstances. 6 months ago I was homeless and hungry, dismissed as worthless by people who judged me based on appearances rather than character, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system to reach every corner of the gathered crowd. And today I stand here as the architect of a memorial that will honor the memory of 17 people who deserved better than they got from the systems that were supposed to protect them. The parallel wasn't lost on anyone present, the way individual and community redemption had occurred simultaneously, the recognition that second chances and renewed hope were possible for both people and places when decent individuals were willing to look past surface appearances to see potential and possibility. This memorial represents what's best about our community, I continued. Our refusal to accept that tragedy has to be the end of the story, our commitment to finding meaning and beauty even in the aftermath of preventable loss, our belief that we can build something better when we work together with integrity and care. The applause that followed was sustained and heartfelt, expressions of approval and support from people who had participated in various ways in the memorial's creation, who had contributed money or time or simply moral support to ensure that the project succeeded despite the obstacles and challenges that had threatened its completion. As the ceremony concluded and people began to explore the memorial's various spaces and features, I found myself standing alone for a moment near the central fountain, watching children play in the interactive water features while their parents read the memorial walls, seeing exactly what we had hoped to achieve, the integration of remembrance and celebration that makes memorial spaces truly successful. Sarah appeared beside me, her presence welcome and comfortable after the months of friendship that had grown from our initial encounter in the diner, her face bright with pride and satisfaction as she watched families enjoying the space we had created together through our various contributions to the project. "It's perfect," she said simply, her words carrying more weight than elaborate praise, because perfection in architecture isn't about flawless execution but about achieving the right relationship between form and function, between individual vision and community needs, between memorial purpose and daily life. The memorial park quickly became a beloved community gathering place, exactly as we had intended, hosting everything from quiet individual reflection to large community events, serving as a focal point for neighborhood life while maintaining its primary function as a place to honor those who had been lost. The success of the project led to other commissions, the urban renewal initiative that Mayor Hartwell had described during our first meeting becoming reality as the city committed to comprehensive neighborhood improvement, affordable housing projects and community centers and green spaces that would transform neglected areas into thriving centers of family life. My architectural practice was rebuilt on a foundation of community engagement and social responsibility, the lessons learned during my months of homelessness influencing every project I undertook, ensuring that my designs would always consider the needs of society's most vulnerable members, that beautiful spaces would be accessible to everyone regardless of income or social status. The criminal trial of Morrison and Associates concluded with convictions on all major charges, lengthy prison sentences for the company's leadership and substantial financial penalties that would ensure they could never again victimize innocent people through corruption and negligence, justice served in ways that provided closure and deterrence. But the most significant outcome wasn't legal but personal, the transformation of my own understanding about what makes life meaningful and valuable, the recognition that worth isn't determined by external markers of success but by our commitment to serving others, to creating beauty and hope in a world that often seems determined to crush both. Years later, when I give talks about memorial architecture or community design, I always begin with the story of the night I was refused service at Henderson's Diner, how a moment of casual cruelty was transformed into an opportunity for redemption through the intervention of someone who chose to see potential rather than just problems. The lesson isn't about homelessness or architecture or even about the corruption that can destroy lives and communities, but about the fundamental human responsibility to look beyond appearances, to offer dignity and respect to everyone we encounter, to remember that circumstances can change quickly and dramatically, that any of us might someday need the kindness of strangers to survive and thrive. The Memorial Park still stands as testament to what's possible when communities commit to integrity and care, when tragedy is transformed into beauty through the application of human creativity and mutual support, when second chances are offered to those who need them most, when hope triumphs over despair through the simple act of refusing to give up on each other. Every time I visit the memorial, I'm reminded of the journey that brought me there, from the depths of despair to the heights of professional and personal fulfillment, from isolation to connection, from shame to pride, from homelessness to home, the remarkable transformation that began with a simple act of recognition and kindness on a rainy Tuesday night when I thought my story was over but it was actually just beginning.